How is there not a single video on YouTube talking about the Olympus 40 to 150mm f2.8 for portraits? So I decided to make one for you. Welcome back to the channel. Now, if you've seen any of my gear reviews, you'd know that I pretty much give you some real-world examples and meaningful tests that make sense to professionals that use them on a daily basis. Now, I'm going to get into a ton of sample shots and examples of focal lengths, probably a lot that you've never seen that you probably want to see from zoom lenses. But what kind of sparked this idea is the hatred around crop sensors and micro four thirds, particularly that you don't get really a lot of good depth of field. Now, in saying that, I've reviewed a ton of Sigma lenses as well, the 16mm, 30mm and the 56mm 1.4, which is an amazing lens for portraits. However, I love a lot of compression. So around 200 to 300mm for me gives me some of the best portraits as you get less distortion on your subject's face. Now, starting off, we're going to get straight into the build quality. Honestly, if you've ever held an Olympus Pro lens, you'll understand. It's a solid chunk of metal and this lens is no different. I love the no rubber zoom or focus ring because usually all my zoom lenses eventually, that little zoom rubber kind of just starts melting away. It starts to like stretch out and it just kind of hangs on your lens eventually, and you start putting other zoom rings over it just to kind of hold it in place because you don't want to take it in for a service because you probably don't have time. So this metal grippy zoom ring is brilliant. And then you've got the lens hood. Genius. I'm not sure if you've ever dropped and broken a lens hood. They're insanely expensive, but this one shifts out into place and then you give this ring a slight twist and it slides back down. So your lens hood doesn't actually come off, which is a damn cool idea. Then you have the focus ring. Now, it does have a manual clutch. Now, if you've worked with a lot of modern day lenses, particularly micro four thirds and a lot of Sony lenses, they focus by wire. Now, if you've used focus by wire, you'd understand that they're very inaccurate due to the speed that you turn the focus ring changes the distance in which it focuses. However, when you pop down the manual clutch, it turns into a very normal lens and it even has a hard stop on either side. And this is quite standard across most of the Olympus Pro lenses. Now, the lens does have a bunch of glass elements and in different groups and all of that stuff. A 72mm filter thread in the front. Now, all of that stuff means something to some people. But when it comes to real world tests, that's really the deciding factor of any lens. Zoom range and aperture. Now we're getting into the fun stuff about the lens, and this is pretty much going to be the bulk of this video. And this is where this lens excels and beats every other lens I've ever used. So it has a 40 to 150mm zoom range, essentially an 80 to 300mm full frame equivalent. And yes, it's an internal zoom, so the lens doesn't extend out or in. It's a constant f2.8 aperture right through from 40 to 150mm or 80 to 300. Now, I'm not going to get into this whole aperture thing about 2.8 is not 2.8 on micro four thirds and all of this. I've made a video explaining like aperture and full frame versus micro four thirds, which I'll drop up here. It's a major eye opener and I want you to watch with an open mind because it really changed how you think about micro four thirds and crop sensors. But what I do want you to understand just briefly is that at f2.8 on a micro four thirds sensor, you get f2.8 light. However, you are getting an f5.6 looking depth of field. However, where that changes with this lens is due to the fact that you technically zoom in full frame 300mm. And if you've ever shot above 200mm on a full frame sensor, you'd know that at f2.8, full frame 2.8, your depth of field is insanely shallow and you don't shoot it at that. As a professional photographer shooting weddings and events on the fly, you're generally shooting your 200mm lens at around 3.5 f4 just to make sure you get the shot. So at 300mm at f5.6, this is mind-blowing. Now, what does this f2.8 aperture with the zoom really mean? Well, there's two tests to kind of do here and show exactly why a lens like this is so great. One is the zoom range from a stationary point. In other words, standing in one spot and zooming in and you'd see the total focal range. I mean, after all, that's what you really want to see. However, there is a second test that is extremely important when it comes to delivering portraits, and that is zooming while keeping the subject frame the same. So basically, as you zoom in, you walk back. First, I'm going to show you some video footage of me actually zooming in, and you can see it in real time as I filmed it on the GH6. Now keep in mind, every shot that you're going to see on this entire video with this lens is at f2.8. So this is at 40mm. This is zooming into 50mm. 100mm. And 150mm. As you can see, I constantly had to refocus, so this lens is by no means parfocal, if you were wondering. Now what I want you to take note of is how the compression changes and how much bokeh starts developing even though you're still shooting at the same camera settings, but just that zoom range, that compression, and how it develops so much depth of field and isolates that subject. Here's a different scene just to get some bokeh balls in the background. This is at 40mm, 50mm, 70mm, 100, and finally zoomed in at a full 150mm. And just for portrait's sake, 40mm, 80mm, 100mm, and 150mm. If you're into making some TikToks with a super zoomed in lens, or just kind of for the idea of shooting portraits. Like I said, all these shots have been taken with the GH6, and I've done a video on the GH6 versus the G9, which I'll drop up here, as well as leave a link in the description so you can watch it after this. And it's an amazing video to watch. We really went in depth with GH6 versus G9. But what I do want to tell you that is, if you do have a G9 with a battery pack on, this lens feels really good in the hand. It kind of gives you that nice bulky kind of feel and very sturdy in the hands, especially when you're shooting events. Okay, so why am I here talking about this amazing zoom range that it's got? And I'm specifically talking about portrait lenses. Now this is where most amateurs make a mistake when they buy a zoom lens. They don't really use the zoom. Now if you're wondering what I mean, this is where we get to test number 2. So test number 2 is zooming in while moving backwards, essentially keeping the subject frame the same. All that you're doing is you're changing really the compression, as well as you increasing the depth of field, because depth of field is a mix of aperture as well as zoom and distance to subject. Let me just show you. So this is at 40mm, 50mm, 67mm, 97mm, and finally 150mm. Now let's put the 40 and the 150 side by side. Now I think it's starting to make sense why you should be zooming in with a lens. These are the same shots. Remember, all the settings have stayed exactly the same. But that is just how insanely different it looks from zooming in and walking back. Here's another shot at 40mm. I walk back quite a distance and fully zoom in and then shoot it at 150mm. This is what it looks like side by side. Now honestly, the Olympus 40 to 150mm is probably the best lens that any micro four thirds user could own. There is no other lens like this on the market at all for full frame or anything like that with this type of range, and this is why this lens is so fantastic. Whether you shoot in events or weddings or portraits, this lens could pretty much stay on your camera the entire time. Sharpness. What did you think? Wide open, f2.8, pin sharp. Check these shots. Now I'm not going to shoot some bricks. Bricks aren't as pretty as these two ladies. So here are a few shots with some crazy crops just to look at the sharpness. Now the lens really does focus extremely fast, and a lot of this will pretty much be based on the system that you're using. So if you're using a G9 or an Olympus camera or the new GH6, you're probably going to be hitting focus 99% of the time. To give you an idea, we took about 650 shots on the shoot, and of those shots, there's about 7 or 8 that aren't in focus, giving us a 1% miss rate and a 99% hit rate. Chromatic aberration. Now if you thought there has to be something wrong with this lens, you'd be wrong. Here are some shots really trying to pull out the chromatic aberration of this lens. And honestly, I can pretty much get nothing out of it. Throughout the focal range, the lens is fantastic. I don't get any color fringing. Even when the sun's hitting the leaves from behind, this lens is manufactured to perfection. Now, yes, it is a slightly pricey lens, and I'll put the current pricing over here. Just keep in mind this may change over time, but on Amazon currently you're getting a ton of specials all the time on this lens, sometimes $100, sometimes $300 off. And now for some side notes. These aren't really negatives of the lens, but it's just something that I thought I have to mention. Now, if you're using this with a GH5 or GH6 or G9, you're not going to get the dual IBIS that you'd get from, say, for instance, the Lumix 35-100. Another point, if you wanted to go down into the comments and say, but hey Rich, how would this compare to the 35-100 that you just mentioned? Well, honestly, at 100mm and at 150mm, which is essentially 200 and 300, at 300mm you're going to get a lot more compression and a lot more depth of field. So honestly, I don't see the need in buying a 35-100mm unless you're using it maybe for handheld video. And that's just due to the fact that you're going to get the dual IBIS out of the Panasonic and the Lumix system. Also, this little function button doesn't work on the Lumix system. If you know a way to get it to work, let me know in the comments below, but from what I've read up as well, it only works with Olympus cameras. Did I mention that the GH6 shoots 75 frames per second RAW? Did a test with this, had the model walk past, and as she walked, just kind of did a burst of about 90 odd images. And if you're wondering how that looks on a 24p timeline, check this out. Now these are raw images, so if you punch in and you zoom in, they are still pretty damn sharp for a moving shot. So that's it from me. I hope you enjoyed this video. Honestly, the Olympus 40-150 is probably the ultimate lens for any micro four thirds shooter. And if you don't have one of these in your bag and you're doing photography, I suggest you pick one up. This is hands down the best portrait lens I've ever owned. And I'm talking Nikon, Sigma, Tamron, even Nikon full frame. This beats them all. I will drop an affiliate link in the description below where you can pick up this lens. Obviously, if you do buy there, I think Amazon pays me like a very, very tiny commission that allows me to buy more Red Bull to continue building my wall, or buy Lego, one of the two. So thanks for watching, wherever you are in the world. Have a good day, good evening, good night, goodbye.